diplomacy, or military training, or for any other reason, the interlocutors are likely to anticipate some variations in phonology, lexicon, or grammar. However, they may be less likely to expect pragmatic variations. One of the most notable pragmatic elements of Israeli discourse patterns is a marked preference for directness. When communication occurs between Israeli and American interlocutors, Israeli directness can be misinterpreted and stereotyped as rude or impolite, and American indirectness can be misinterpreted as superficial or insincere. Politeness researcher Bloom Kolka conducted a series of studies that highlight the cross-cultural differences in American and Israeli politeness strategies. In one experiment, she compared the perceptions held by Americans and Israelis on indirectness and politeness in requests. To conduct the experiment, she first classified request strategies into 9 categories, ranging from most direct, which included mood derivables or imperative sentences, to least direct, which included mild hints. She then asked 4 groups of American native English speakers and Israeli native Hebrew speakers to rate the directness and level of politeness of 5 requests in each category. She found that overall, American English speakers perceived indirectness as more polite, while native Hebrew speakers perceived directness as more polite. More specifically, her results indicate that performatives, which include requests like, "I'm asking you to move your car," are considered direct by both groups, but Israelis perceive them as more polite, the 3rd most polite, and Americans perceive them as less polite, the 6th most polite. She further found that hints are considered less polite by Israeli speakers than they are by American speakers. Overall, her study illustrates that directness and indirectness are interpreted in different ways depending on the L1. In a second study, Bloom-Kolka analyzed politeness and directness within the unique context of the family dinner table. She observed the discourse of Israeli families, American immigrant families, and American families during dinner time. After analyzing her observations, she determined the traditional association of directness and impoliteness to be invalid in this special domain because directness indicates parental power and intimacy, not impoliteness. In order to adjust for the family environment, Bloom-Kolka developed an alternative politeness scale. According to this scale, parental speech acts can be considered either unmarked for politeness or marked for politeness. In the study, unmarked speech acts were either impolite or neutral. On the other hand, marked speech acts came in the form of mitigated directness, conventional indirectness, or non-conventional indirectness. Of the marked speech acts, Bloom-Kolka found that Israelis and Americans once again choose different politeness strategies. While American parents tend to use indirectness to mark a speech act for politeness, Israeli parents tend to use mitigated directness, and immigrant parents fall in between. This study further highlights the pragmatic differences between Israeli English and American English, even within the unique context of the family dinner. Researchers account for these variations in discourse systems by considering the impacts of pragmatic transfer. Casper, who is a leading scholar in the field of interlanguage pragmatics, explains that pragmatic transfer occurs when a speaker's pragmatic knowledge from one language influences how they use a different language. She further distinguishes between pragmalinguistics and sociopragmatics. Pragmalinguistics are linguistic means of conveying politeness, and sociopragmatics are based on socially appropriate linguistic behavior. Some examples of pragmalinguistic influences in Hebrew and English are evident in Bloom-Kolka's study on request strategies. Native Hebrew speakers may have rated performatives, like "I'm asking you to move your car," as more polite than American English speakers because, as Bloom-Kolka explains, in Hebrew, the verb levakas, to ask, and the adverb bevakas, please, are derived from the same root. Thus, unlike English, the use of the performative in Hebrew already marks the pattern for politeness. In the same study, Bloom-Kulka notes another important pragmalinguistic variation in Hebrew and English requests. In English, want statements are habitually phrased as, "I would like you to do X," whereas Hebrew want statements are habitually phrased as, "I want you to do X," a request that sounds more direct when transferred into English. Sociopragmatics also play an important role. Perhaps the most prominent sociopragmatic influence on Israeli communication patterns is the notion of degree. Degree means straight or direct talk in Hebrew. In an ethnographic study, Catriel found it to be positively associated with 5 clusters of meanings, which impact Hebrew and Israeli English pragmatic norms. First, it is associated with sincerity, which she describes in terms of being true to oneself. Second, it is associated with assertiveness. Catriel expands on this meaning cluster with words like strength, determination, daring, courage, activity, and defiance. The third meaning cluster is naturalness. This is described as earthiness, simplicity, and spontaneity. Fourth is communitas, or in other words, solidarity. The fifth and final meaning cluster is anti-style, which Catriel describes as a matter-of-factness, or a preference for deeds over words. These 5 clusters represent not only the symbolic meanings of degree, but also pragmatic values that have influenced Israeli discourse systems and informed speakers of the appropriacy of a speech act. So, the high positive value assigned to sincerity may explain why, in Bloom-Kulka's first study, Israeli participants rated hints as less polite than American participants. Bloom-Kulka suggests that while hinting would be appropriate in American English, it would go against the Israeli socio-pragmatic preference for forthrightness. Also, the concept of communitas may explain why in Bloom-Kulka's second study, Israeli directives were marked for politeness with mitigated directness, and the American directives were marked with indirectness. Bloom-Kulka posits that the Israeli strategy of nicknaming acts to maximize solidarity, while the indirectness strategy common in American English fulfills the American socio-pragmatic need for independence. Bloom-Kulka and Catriel's studies on American and Israeli communication patterns illustrate how directness and indirectness are used differently in politeness strategies. These differences have been noted and sometimes misinterpreted during American and Israeli interactions. However, Bloom-Kulka and Catriel's studies were conducted over 20 years ago. Since then, globalization and new technology have increased the exposure Americans and Israelis have to one another's discourse systems, and allowed for more frequent intercultural communication. Further research is needed to more fully understand if and how globalization and technology continue to affect the pragmatic norms of American and Israeli Englishes.